Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the SafetyNet Webinar Series. Sorry, I'm getting my computer's talking to me about all sorts of things. Yes, so welcome to our SafetyNet series. Today's session is presented by Kellie Roby of Polaris Aero, and she will be presenting on the very, very timely topic of best practices to transition to a new safety officer. I'm Catherine Hilst, and I am the ISBEO Operations Manager with IBAC, and as the globally recognized voluntary safety standard, ISBEO helps operators apply industry best practices by challenging them to review and compare their safety-related policies, processes, and procedures, and then make improvements, elevating them to the worldwide standard for business aviation safety. A few housekeeping items. All of the attendees are on mute, and you'll stay on mute through the presentation. However, there is a place where you can ask questions. There's a little box that says questions. Type in your questions anytime during the presentation, and we will address those after the presentation with Kellie. I'm so excited to welcome back Polaris Aero and Kellie Roby. This is our last SafetyNet of 2023. Today, talking about being an effective safety officer and how that requires a unique skill set and the desire and ability to continuously learn both inside and outside of your organization. Identifying the right person for this role can be challenging, and even more so, finding a successor for that role when the time comes. In this session, Kellie will be covering the unique skills and characteristics that make a successful safety manager and talk through best practices for transitioning someone new into that role and succession planning for the safety officer position in the future. Kellie is leads the Polaris Aero Safety Services Division, which specializes in assisting Polaris clients more effectively implement and achieve their safety goals. Prior to joining Polaris, she spent more than a decade honing her skills in Part 135 and Part 91 operations environments in roles ranging from FBO operations, flight ops, serving as a flight crew member on a Beechjet 400 and Hawker 800, safety manager, and most recently a business manager overseeing both scheduling and charter sales for a Part 135 charter and management company. Kellie, welcome back. I'm so happy to have you here, and I'm so excited about this topic, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I appreciate it. Thanks for having us back. Thanks for letting Polaris contribute to the SafetyNet webinar series. Both in the spring and the fall, we really enjoy getting to do this with you guys and providing this content. Thank you to everybody that joined today. I know talking about succession planning is not exactly something that we love to think about. we generally don't like to talk about change in this sort of way, but I promise we'll make it in a fun way, in a way that makes it something that's valuable for your team, and we will go from there. So the first thing we want to talk about, especially in the current landscape that we're in our industry, where a lot of people are changing jobs, are moving around, we've got a lot of people going from place to place, is what makes an effective safety manager? What should you be looking for in that role? And we'll start there, and then we'll talk about what happens if we need to replace that role, and how do we go about making sure that we've got some good plans in place as well. So I want to hear from you as we go through, so please feel free to use that question box. We'll collaborate along the way. Catherine, if you see anything that pops up in the question box that's relevant for the slide that we're on, please feel free to interrupt me and we'll take it along the way, and we'll get going. That. Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so we mentioned in the description that we were talking about what makes an effective safety officer. So initially the thought would be, let's take someone who is looking to grow their career. Let's take, a pilot that's showing some promise or has some additional bandwidth to deliver to the team. Let's take them and let's, they seem to know a little bit about safety. Maybe they asked a vaguely related safety question in a meeting one time, and then they now get the short straw. But let's really think about what makes it an effective safety officer. It's not just about the safety skills and the safety knowledge associated with the role. There's a lot of emotional intelligence that goes into being an effective safety officer. So you have to know how to read people. You have to know how to effectively communicate across teams. So not just your team and the folks that you deal with every day, but also different departments, right? So even if you are in the flight ops team, you need to be able to effectively communicate with your maintenance team, with your scheduling and dispatch team, up and down the ladder as it goes with everyone in the department, all of your stakeholders like the FAA, your auditors, anyone who touches the organization. You need to be able to communicate effectively with them. So there is a bit of emotional intelligence that goes into that, as well as being able to discern when you should use discretion in your communication. So there are a lot of things that come in through the safety office that don't need to be talked about with the rest of the flight ops team or the maintenance team. And knowing when to take that to your supervisor, to your director, knowing when to communicate that out, knowing when to scrub reports and de-identify data and how to communicate that effectively is very, very important for this role. This is the #1 thing that helps you build trust within your department, within your safety organization, and ultimately helps your safety culture. And that's not really something that is taught, right? So like when you're going through flight school or you're going through your A&P school, we're not really talking about communicating with discretion very often in our recurrent classes, or emotional intelligence or things like that. So when you are looking for someone to take over this role as a safety officer, make sure that they're checking off these boxes as well, in addition to obviously some level of technical background, because that is helpful. Again, you don't have to be a pilot to be a safety officer. You don't have to be in maintenance to be a safety officer. We're seeing more and more folks in scheduling and dispatch take over safety roles because they're there on site usually to help with problems that are going on from the day-to-day. But some level of technical background is helpful just to, again, be able to communicate effectively. So as long as you have the ability to communicate, that level of technical background is helpful. And then last but not least, again, some level of technical background is helpful, but you don't have to know everything. And that is a common misconception, that the safety officer will just take anything that is vaguely safety related and they'll just put that over there in the safety department and they'll just handle it. Right? So that would require a safety officer to know everything in a drill down fashion on the maintenance front, on the pilot front, on the scheduling and dispatch front, on your accounting front, anyone who touches your department. And that's just not reasonable for us to expect of someone who's in that safety role. Ultimately, what the safety officer needs to know, instead of being all-knowing about all things or feeling like they should be all-knowing about all things, is just knowing when to raise your hand and say, hey, I need some subject matter expertise in this particular area. I'm going to reach out to my maintenance safety liaison or my flight ops safety liaison, or someone who can speak into this now that I've gotten to a point where I need some technical acumen on this particular issue. So keeping these things in mind when you are looking for a safety officer to take on this role, or figuring out, if you are the safety officer, figuring out where you can fill some gaps in where you're wanting to progress. These are things to keep in mind on top of your technical background. So we've talked a little bit about the traits of an effective safety officer, which is one portion of what makes your operation resilient and have results. Let's see here, there we go. So that's the people part. If you've seen our presentations before, we talk a lot about the three-legged stool of people, process, and technology. And this is no different, right? So you can have someone who's emotionally intelligent, you can have someone who has technical background and communicates effectively with teams, but if they're not well-trained, and if they're not appropriately resourced or engaged in what they're doing, empowered, encouraged to solve problems, then it's all for naught, right? Additionally, you can have those people on your team, but if the process isn't well defined, if you don't have a consistent process, if it's not flexible and results oriented, then we're going to have an issue there as well. And then certainly technology can help us leverage both of those aspects to make it a little more streamlined, simple, seamless, and meaningful in the way that you're doing that. So we're going to come back to this three-legged stool, and we're going to talk about the different aspects of people, process, and technology and how those things play a role. Since this is talking about the safety officer, we're going to focus on the people part first and what it means to be well-trained, first of all, what it means to be appropriately resourced, etc. So the first thing we want to make sure that we have in our safety officer, on top of all those things that we talked about at the beginning about emotional intelligence and the ability to communicate, would be training. So not just training in your subject matter, but also general industry safety training. So congratulations, you're on the IBAC SafetyNet webinar series. This counts as training towards general industry safety training, but also taking a look at some other industry standards like the ISBAO and ISBA standard courses. They have great courses through IBAC for that. If you want to look at the NBAA SMS certificate course, that's a great baseline for where to start as a safety manager. USC has a great course for safety managers if you want to drill into some specific items as well. So looking to some of that general industry safety training would be helpful if someone has no safety experience whatsoever. That's a good baseline. We also want to make sure that we're taking this SMS theory and safety theory and giving it a place to go. So if you have a platform, if you're using a formal system, you want to make sure that your safety manager has platform specific training as well. So again, if you've got all this great knowledge about the 4 pillars and the components of SMS and how all of it's supposed to work together, but you don't have anywhere to put it, or you don't know how to use your system, then your system becomes a hindrance instead of a help. So getting some platform specific training if you do have a formal SMS platform and making sure that you're making good use of that training. So the next thing we want to make sure that we do is rely on any additional consulting or mentoring that we can get. Excuse me, there's our build. Okay, so again, not just the theory of the 4 pillars and the components of an SMS paired with your platform specific training, but then you get to the how, right? So this is great. We know that we're supposed to do policies. We know that we're supposed to do safety risk management and assurance and safety promotion. We have a platform by which to do all of that. Now, how do we do that? How do we implement that? How do we roll it out? What works best with the processes we already have, et cetera? You can reach out to your vendors for that. There's a lot of safety vendors that offer additional consulting or third-party consulting services if you need assistance on how to apply that for your organization or scale it for your organization beyond theory, beyond where to point and click in your system and those sorts of things. And then the last one I mentioned here is mentoring. So if you are in the position where you have the opportunity to overlap with the previous safety officer or someone in your organization who's worked in a safety role, even someone in a local and regional group who sits in a safety position at their company, and you can get some mentoring and learning from what they're doing on their side. The more mentoring and shadowing you have available, the better off you're going to be, sort of learning the ropes there as you go along. Now, I do want to mention that this is not like a one and done deal. We need to make sure that we are training over time, a bit of a continuous learning experience, if you will. So you may send your brand new green safety officer to some, let's say like an ISBAO course, for example. You send them to the ISBAO course, they come back with all their notes, they're super excited. They go sit through their platform training and they learn how to use your software and they're super excited. They get all this additional mentoring and consulting and they know how to apply it now and they're super excited. And then they get turned loose on their own. A couple of reports come in the system and they start realizing, oh, you know, I may need some additional stuff on from the USC course, or maybe some additional deep dives into specific parts of the software. So it's a bit like an onion where you need to peel back different layers. And as you start to get more involved, as your safety reports start to get a little more mature, you may need to double back on some of those areas of training just to make sure that you're really retaining that information. Ultimately, again, we've got this training available to us. I would say if you don't have anyone in that position yet, or if you're looking to hire someone and then train them up in these specific areas, I would just focus on hiring good people, not necessarily the people that tick all the boxes on the right-hand side here, but focus on hiring the good people with strong judgment. So we always say, you know, that we want to make sure they can make sound decisions with limited information, because very, very few times you ever get a safety report that comes in your system that has all the information, right? We're having to do a lot of deducing and figuring out what came from where and drilling down into information. You need someone who's got that strong judgment, who knows when to use discretion, who knows how to communicate up and down the ladder. And ultimately, if you've got good people with strong judgment that can make those good decisions, the rest of this will fall into place. So make that your focus if you're looking for someone new. Okay, so let's say that you have someone that's already doing all those things. Things are going great. and they're checking all those boxes. They've been to training. You got your dream safety manager who's running things. And I'm going to give you a best case scenario here, which would be at some point in the future, they retire after 30 years at your flight department, and you're going to do the water cannons and the whole big send off, and they're going to go on their merry way. Or your safety manager goes on maternity leave, and this would be a best case scenario because you actually get them back at some point. So preparing for those two examples would be a best case scenario. Why is it a best case scenario? Because you have plenty of notice and plenty of time to plan for these particular events. So let's take a look at that. Let's see, is it gonna work with me? There we go. Okay, let's take a look at that. So we're gonna go back to our three-legged stool here. We've got our people, process, and technology. And then this is our key retirements or our maternity leave. So what do we do now that we've got our people part that has now gone, our portion of the stool that is now gone? We really need to beef up and supercharge our processes and our technology while we have that gap to help hold up the rest of the stool, right? So we're going to look at those different things and how we can do that in the meantime, in this example, ahead of time, to make sure that we're planning for those things and we've got a good contingency plan, a good method for consistency, either during that leave of absence for maternity leave, or once we have maybe some overlap with a retirement and a new safety officer coming in. So let's take a look at each one of those. We'll take a look at the processes first. So what can we do in terms of process to supercharge this and make sure that we're set up for success? The first thing we're going to do is a review of all of your processes, which sounds a little bit elementary, but a thorough review of your processes and procedures is really going to help you define if you have written certain policies and procedures specific to that individual. I know best practice would say that we are not supposed to do that. We're supposed to write policies and procedures for anyone who could fill that role, but especially if you've had a safety officer who's been in that role for a long time, you know, we find ourselves maybe giving them a little more responsibility, or, oh, they have a background in XYZ, so we're also going to let them be responsible for this, but we need to document that process, so let's just write it in the manual. So going through that again, very elementary step, but just reviewing those processes to make sure we have not deviated from that, and we've written this policy to apply to anyone who could fill this role and not just that individual, is super, super important. So are there policies or procedures that exist just do the specific roles and capabilities that we need to refine for someone else to take that on? Another view that you want to take on or take a look at would be their role, basically their job description. So I'm not sure what your specific flight department does or your organization does, but if you're not doing an annual review of job descriptions, a job analysis, if you will, each year, and in whether that's an annual review type thing where it's put in with your corporate structure or not, this would be the time to do it. So taking a look at that job description, make sure we don't have any mission creep, again, things that people have taken on that they're not necessarily written in the job description over the many years that they've held that role, and making sure that whatever that role includes is very well documented. I'll give you an example of this just for the sake of clarifying why this is important. I recently took over as an interim safety officer for a company who had their safety officer going on maternity leave. And she had worked very, very hard to establish the culture and get the product up and running and getting everyone comfortable with what was going on. And she was very nervous to leave the product unattended or to have any sort of optics of other people being in the platform, seeing things that maybe only should go to the safety officer on an internal basis, right? So she wanted a third party to come in and administer the system, someone who knew the system, someone who was at arm's length from the organization, so that there was some discretion there as well, who could redact reports and then give that back to them. But the first conversation we had was, what roles and responsibilities are you wanting me to take over this 4-month period? and what time requirements are we looking to do? Because obviously we can't scope the assistance without some sort of ability to do that. So if you're looking for interim assistance or someone to step into that role, or even looking for someone internally to take on a role and understanding what their bandwidth limits are in addition to their day job, right? Either being on the floor as an A&P or flying the line and taking on that additional responsibility, you have to have some sort of metric for what is involved in that safety role. If that's not a full-time position. If it is a full-time position and you're looking to fill it anyway, again, that's only going to help you when trying to backfill that position. So it's really not a hindrance. It's just a matter of sitting down and doing it, right? And then the last thing would be really something that we talk about more in the lens of change management. So when we talk about what does this position touch, if that's a list of systems or logins, vendor interfaces, process. For example, this is a different situation, but I took over a safety role for another organization who also had their safety manager as their FOQA gatekeeper. And no one knew who had the login for FOQA, and no one knew where the password reset emails went until after the safety manager was gone. And so things like that could be very easily addressed if we just have a list of logins or who's responsible for submitting invoices. And you'd never want things like that, like, for example, your safety system invoice to be going into an email address that no longer works, right? So keeping that list fresh, reviewing it every year, making sure that we've got a good take and a good handle on what people are responsible for, and then keeping that up to date. I would say the biggest part, especially for our leaders on the call, I do see a couple of directors on the call here, a really good sign of a strong culture is when your people believe, just in general, that we should all leave our current roles better than when we found them. So it would be nice to think that everyone who gets hired into their current role, like, this is my life or job, right? This is the one I'm going to retire from. I'm always going to be here. But we all know that that's probably not the case, just statistically. And if we can just make sure that as we're promoting our people from within, or as they're retiring, or as they're moving on to greener pastures, that we all have the general belief that we should leave things better than when we found them, then that's really going to be a good sign of your strong safety culture. And that really starts with documenting the role itself. You can document that role. It starts the ability to plan for succession along the way. And that's a huge leadership component of making sure that your people feel valued within your organization. And the safety officer role is no exception to that. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the process. Now let's talk about the technology portion. So the technology portion, I want to make sure we're not sleeping on that. That's really something that we can supercharge as well to help streamline what we're doing with these other two legs of the stool here. So while it would be very easy to redefine, let's say, redefine the job description or make some edits to a manual to say, okay, well, Bob used to do this because Bob had a flying background, but now our new safety manager is going to be in maintenance, so we're just going to update this in the manual so it doesn't say that anymore. Don't stop at the manual, okay? Don't just edit the manual and then put it back on the shelf and then no one's going to read it again. Let's make sure that we are codifying these knowledge bits along the way of all this effort that we're putting into documenting this and putting it in our technology so our technology will work for us. So what does this look like? Ultimately, things like process and procedure compliance, that all happens through your technology anyway. And when changes happen, and they will inevitably happen, we want to make sure that if the safety officer is there or not, or even in situations where maybe your safety officer is on vacation, let's say, we want to make sure those procedures and processes are still being complied with over time. So that basically says the same thing. They're just making sure we're codifying processes and procedures. If you've been in our previous IBAC webinars, we've talked about safety knowledge management, and this is exactly what we're hitting on there. Examples of safety knowledge management would be putting risk controls in based on safety reports that have come in your system so that they're not tribal knowledge within your organization, and they actually go back into your technology to help future iterations of your team. So this is what that would look like. Again, supercharging your technology to make sure it's working for you. This is an example of a safety report that's come in, and we figured out over time that when these conditions exist, we have a propensity to land the aircraft long. And so we're going to codify that knowledge into our safety system to make sure that whether I'm the safety officer or not, or someone coming after me as a safety officer, that they still have this information and they know when these conditions exist, we have a propensity to land the aircraft long, and they should be aware of that. You could do the same thing for waivers for fatigue issues and making sure that that process is followed correctly, or duty time extensions or things like that. Anything that's written in your FOM or documented in any sort of way can go into this system and then help, again, propel that even after you're gone, or after you need to make changes in that position. So we're going to supercharge our processes. We're going to supercharge our technology to help lift that missing leg of the stool for however long it exists. But I will say too, one thing we want to make sure that we do is fill that void as soon as we can. And if we can't, we have a couple of other things that we can do. So the example that we just went through was based on either a maternity leave or a retirement, where we have lots of time to prepare for those departures. You know, a retirement notice, maybe you have 3 or 4 months to plan for that. A maternity leave, obviously you've got a little more time as well, so to plan for overlap, or maybe some interim help from a vendor, or what have you, documenting all those processes and procedures. If you have what we're going to call a not so best case scenario, and we'll just leave it at sudden vacancy, right? Whether that's we would like to invite you to no longer be an employee here anymore, or it is with a heavy heart email. You know, those sorts of situations where we lose someone within 2 weeks and we need someone in there managing the system that's a well-oiled machine by now. Now we've got to sort of backtrack and figure out where we can put a Band-Aid on this to make sure we're not going to lose any ground that we've gained in our system. So let's talk about that a little bit. Maybe my slide will go to the next one. There we go. Okay. So let's talk about that a little bit. What does that look like in a not so best case scenario? This would be, again, we're going to go back to that reviewing of processes and procedures. This will probably be in a more expedited fashion than if you have 3 or 4 months to plan. But a review of processes and procedures, no less, just to ensure that at the very least, we're not missing processes and procedures that are written down, and we're still making sure that those are getting done according to what we've said we're going to do. In that 2 weeks, if you have 2 weeks, document as much as possible about the roles and responsibilities before they depart. If you have any sort of time with them whatsoever, use it to document. Use it to document what they're touching, what logins that they are using or familiar with, what invoices are coming in, anything that they're touching or have a hand in a process for. Make sure that that you're documenting that, so anyone who comes in after them at least doesn't have to start from scratch. That'll be a huge help in that regard. We just talked about a list of systems, logins, vendor interfaces, process touch points, etc. Ultimately, what we're talking about here is change management. So anytime you're going through a change like this, whether it's a planned change or a sudden vacancy, we're wanting to go through the change management process, which would be, let's identify what's changing. Let's identify what happens because of this change and what points in our system that it touches, and then assess the risk based on what points that touches. So we're saying the same things here, just understand that change management is essentially this. We're reviewing what we're going to do, documenting it all, and then assessing the risk of what's changing over time. Okay, so then we're going to double back after doing that and just review the previous slides for traits of an effective safety officer, right? Because now we have a void to fill in a very short timeline to do so. So review those traits, make sure that we're not rushing to fill that void. This needs to be the right hire. Don't rush to fill this void and say, okay, all right, well, you know, Bob has really been doing a great job, and he's a great pilot or a great mechanic, and we need to give him some additional duties, and this is a great time to do that because now we have a void. let's make sure Bob is hitting those traits of an effective safety officer and not just being a great pilot, and we want to reward him for that, right? Because that is the #1 way that you can tank your safety culture, is if you have a departure and then fill it or backfill it with the wrong person who doesn't understand how to communicate effectively, how to read people and have emotional intelligence, how to treat things with discretion that need to be treated with discretion. So make sure that's the right hire and don't rush that situation. I know that's going to be hard to do because there's a lot to do in the safety role, and certainly the longer that void goes without being filled, the more there is for someone to do whenever they get in there. But certainly you can lean on your third-party resources, your vendors, to help maintain that continuity during your search. So if you feel like your platform is the most complicated or the biggest void or piece of it that you need to fill, call your platform provider and say, hey, this is our situation. Do you have an option to help us? That's how I got brought on to help with the safety officer that was going on maternity leave, because I knew her system. I came in to help and provided that continuity over that 3 to 4 month span. You can do the same thing if you've got third-party auditing services or an auditing group like just throwing names out, but like a Mente or a Van Allen or something like that. You can utilize them, ask them for referrals. Hey, do you know of anyone who can help us maintain this continuity over time? And they'd be happy to point you in the right direction for that, because ultimately, if we're all safer, the rising tide lifts all ships during that. So there are third-party resources that can help you maintain that continuity, or at least pieces of it that you're unfamiliar with or don't have subject matter expertise in. So don't let that void drive you to hire the wrong person for that role or bring someone into that role that's not the right fit for that. And then again, filling any knowledge gaps with that new hire. Let's say that you bring on that new hire and they meet all of those traits of an effective safety officer, but maybe they're new to safety in general. They have all of the emotional intelligence and the ability to do all the other things, but they've just never dealt with SMS in a flight department sense. Take the time to fill those knowledge gaps. Again, understanding that it's a bit of an onion, so you may have to double back on certain pieces of it. It's a bit like drinking from a fire hydrant if you've never managed a safety program like that before. So they may need to do a little bit of industry training, a little bit of platform training, a little bit of mentoring, and then double back to their industry training and sort of peel back that onion one layer at a time to really let it stick before they feel like they can manage that safety program effectively. And then ultimately, after all of this and all the way through this process, we want to make sure that we're debriefing and documenting using that people, process, and technology template. So anything that you can debrief out of this, again, this is a piece of change management, is looking at all the things that changed over time. What were the risks associated with those changes, and how do we mitigate those? And then what can we learn from this in the next time this happens, whether that's with the safety officer or maybe the chief pilot or the director of maintenance or someone else that is in a higher level role that we'll need to fill eventually sometime. So what things can we take from that debrief and use for our knowledge for next time? And do not just put them in a manual or an email. Put them in your safety system, put them in a system that helps you codify that knowledge for not just you, but the people that will come after you, okay? All right, I know that we've talked about a lot today, and we did that in a very short amount of time. I told Catherine that I had a lot of coffee this morning because I took a red eye back from Scottsdale last night from our strategy meeting. So this was going to be the fastest webinar ever, but I'm sure that we've got some questions in the queue, judging by the folks that we've got on the call here today. I know we've got some leadership folks on this call. If you've got any questions that I can answer, I'm happy to do that. And Catherine, I'll hand it over to you if you've got anything for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelly. One question that I'll address right now, and you can fill in as needed, was a question about the availability of the slides. And I just wanted to remind everyone that the presentation is being recorded, so it'll be available on the IBAC website, and you can access it that way. Also, you see Kelly's information here, so I'm guessing that Kelly would welcome any conversations about this. You want to speak to that for a second, Kelly?
No, absolutely. I'm happy. Any questions that you've got along the way, I'm happy to connect with you.
Awesome. I think that because that's your job.
That's my job.
That's your job. No, and this is something that that we are seeing more and more. I get a lot of people coming through the workshop who are brand new safety officers, and so your sort of step-by-step guide here is really helpful for that. With you know, I was also reminded as you're talking about writing down all of the processes and the things you do to make it easier as this role transitions, where it seems to me like our team is constantly in this, you know, updating and revising. So just one question here on if you have any recommendation on how often do you assess and document roles and responsibilities? Do you look at the processes and update them? So any thoughts on that?
Sure. No, that's a great question. I mean, ultimately, I mean, what you mentioned, if you're doing it constantly, early and often is always the best answer to that. But I know that that's not always a realistic view, especially in the industry that we work in where it's 24/7, 365. And usually we show up to work and we're putting out whatever fires are going on that day. And if that's not the fire, it's not the one that's getting put out. So I would shoot
Yeah,
for at least annually. I
yeah,
think if you can pair it with something that you're already doing from a management level perspective, like annual reviews. I don't know if your team or any of the flight departments on the call or do like the 360 reviews or some sort of annual review system that goes along with the job description and kind of pairs with HR. HR is really good about keeping people on task with things, so that's why I kind of try to pair it with that. But if you have something like that that you could do, or if that's not something that you're doing on the regular, like a job analysis or something like that, you could at least make it a part of your safety risk profile. So safety risk profile is usually an annual event as well, where you're sitting down at either at the end of the year at Q4 to look at the following year upcoming, or at the beginning of the year saying, okay, what risks are we going to face in the present year? You could take that moment to say, okay, let's take a look at the safety officer role and what risks do we see in terms of gaps, knowledge gaps that we need to fill, or mission creep in terms of, you know, the safety officer taking on more than the safety officer is actually responsible for, just because it vaguely resembles safety. All those things are actually risks too. So we need to be mindful of that. And doing this in association with a safety risk profile can be one way to pair that up and make sure we're actually getting it done.
I love it. Just plug it into the processes we already have in place. That's a great suggestion. I like that. I also appreciated your comment about HR people and, you know, who keeps you on task, who makes sure that people are staying up on those timelines and the moments to look back and then look forward. Okay, another one. Safety officer is a part-time role. Any additional recommendations or best practices for part-time positions? And we do see this a lot in the certainly the ISBEO operators. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I also used to be a part-time safety officer. It was like a stipend position, I guess we called it. So I had my full-time role, and then I also had a part-time full-time role, which was my safety officer. So it is a full-time role, right? It's just we're just kind of
Right.
getting at halftime, and some of that is based on, I'm sure, the level of operations that you're at or the scale of the flight department that you're working with. But I would say, especially in those roles, make sure that you are doing those job analysis reviews regularly, because that is especially when it's a part-time role and you're also flying, or you're
Yeah.
also doing maintenance, or you're also doing scheduling, or whatever that is, there's a huge opportunity for mission creep in that particular setup,
Yeah.
because you're just expected to kind of do that on the side. And whatever the side means, it's usually on the side of an already salaried position, right? So mission creep can be a huge factor in that. So documenting and streamlining that is going to be huge. The streamlining part is going to make it easier for you, because again, this is a full-time job on top of a full-time job. So streamlining anything you can, whether that's through processes and plugging those in through your technology to make things easier for you, let that technology do the heavy lifting for you. Or I would say, do not be bashful, especially in those situations, to utilize outside help. A lot of what we see on our side, especially in the stipend positions or part-time safety officer roles, because that person has a sense of like, oh, I'm getting paid to do this in addition to my other job, I should never reach out for additional help, right? Like I'll just get to it when I get to it. And, oh, it's busy this week, we're flying really heavy this week, or, it's the holiday season, we're flying a lot over the holiday season, I'll get to it after the beginning of the year, and the beginning of the year never comes. So, especially in the market that we're in right now, it's busy, most folks are understaffed, they're looking for people. Do not be bashful about being realistic about your workload in your day job, as well as in your other full-time job, and making sure that you're communicating that well to whoever you're reporting to. When you're doing that, note that there are options for third-party resources that can help you with that load. So even if it's just in a busy season and you're like, hey, we've got an ISBAO audit coming up and we just need some help knocking out a couple of projects we've had on the back burner, that it's busy season, we haven't had enough hands, we need someone to come in and just help us get it across the finish line. There are resources for that. Please don't be bashful about using that. That will keep you on task, especially if that's your other job, right? Yeah, and I would say the more you can document what you're doing, A, it helps you communicate to your superior what your bandwidth levels are, but B, when you do go out to your third-party vendors and ask for help, very similar to that maternity leave question that example that I was giving earlier, when I come into an organization to help folks with that, the very first question we talk about is scope. And if you have the ability to define what you're doing in that part-time role and what the scope of the project is that you need help with, that only helps that conversation go quicker. And it's not like one of those, we have to sit down and we have to talk about it. And by the end of it, you're like, well, I could have already had the project done by the end of this conversation. So that really helps if you can do it along the way and making sure that you're staying on top of that.
Yeah, the interesting thing here is you're very eloquent about this. I have a full-time job on a full-time job. One of the questions that came in, it just has to do with compensation, and I think that's part of a bigger thing that you're addressing too, is how is that addressed in the organization? And I hear you saying that in being forthright in the safety risk profile, if you will, of what does it mean to have a full-time pilot taking on safety obligations, and what has to slip or drift in order for whichever fire is hottest, as you mentioned, is being addressed. Just curious because it sounds like you've been here, done this, Kellie. In terms of the part-time roles where you've got someone actively flying and doing the safety role at the same time, is that a level that you see pretty consistently, or in the organizations that you guys are working with? And are you any tips for how to sort of speak up and make clear those potential risks and conflicts?
Absolutely. And it is something that we see quite often, especially in the business aviation and general aviation space, because it's that scalability factor, right? So we're not, not everybody has the ability to go hire a full-time safety person just to manage safety by itself. And that's understandable, right? You shouldn't have to hire a full-time safety person for a very small flight department with very few operations. That's completely understandable. The biggest factor here, if you're going to either sign up for the part-time safety officer role or make that a part of your organization, like a stipend position or something like that, is to be very upfront and honest and have an open dialogue about your level of expectation for that role. What metrics are you measuring their performance on? I'm talking to the leaders here who are putting this role out there. So be very clear about what metrics that we are judging success upon in this part-time role, and then communicate those, and making sure that, okay, if we're trying to hit certain milestones, we're trying to make sure that we're doing X, Y, Z. In 2024, we want to make sure that we're doing these internal audits, this external audit, this training. We want to make sure that we're tracking X, Y, and Z for the flight department, that those things are getting done. And if they're not, or you don't have visibility on them, we should ask. And then if they're not getting done, that should prompt not a conversation about if that person is just lazy or not, but ultimately, I mean, look at the big picture, right? You're looking at are you tasking a pilot who's flying 450 hours a year to also manage safety for your organization? I mean, if things are busy, that should also be in your safety risk profile that flying is up or destinations have changed, and that's a workload that we need to balance in addition to the other duties. So the biggest thing I can say is that hopefully your leadership sees that already, and they are taking notes of what the level of expectations are of that stipend position. If not, if you're the safety officer who has signed up for this stipend role or this part-time gig, and you are trying to figure out if you're being compensated correctly for that, which I think is what we're gathering from the question here, I would sit down and ask for a job analysis, either with your director or with your HR team. At some point, you've either seen a job description of this, or if you haven't seen a job description, this should exist based on this. Feel free to send them this IVAC webinar and tell them that this job description should exist. And make sure that what is being asked of you in that job description is being adequately compensated for. So that's something that HR folks do all the time. That's something that whoever your director or CEO is, they also have a job description and things that they are compensated for. So that shouldn't be a surprise that's something that you're asking for. They should also have a succession plan. So if the succession plan conversation is new to them, that's a bigger conversation as an organization as well. So hope that helps. I know that's not specific compensation numbers. I think there are other better resources that are probably way more up to date than what I could provide for that, but certainly having the conversation about scope versus and job analysis versus what your expectations are will help you have that conversation.
Yeah, it's just the constant communication, right, is keeping everybody aware of what's going on, and discussing those issues just fits right into all of these processes. There was a comment that came in along with a question, just a suggestion about sitting on roundtables, getting involved and seeing what other operations are doing. I think that's that goes to the communications and having that information. And along with that is, what are your thoughts on having co-chair safety officers?
So multiple safety officers. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah. Yeah. Specifically, this says co-chair safety, but so equal roles, but whatever, multiple safety officers. Compare and contrast. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. So that's definitely one way to manage the workload of what goes on and manage that, especially when things are changing over time. I would say whether it's co-chairs of the safety role, a single safety manager, or even managing by safety committee. I've seen that too, where it's just managed by a safety committee. The biggest thing that I would take away from that is making sure you at least have one single point of contact, or one. I mean, in our organization, we call it the belly button, right? Like, where's the belly button? Who's going to make sure that something is moving the ball forward? As long as you have someone who is responsible for making sure things get put in your system, making sure the document gets signed, making sure this gets done. And that is not like, at the end of the day, I think of like that Spider-Man meme where like everyone's pointing at each other and no one's doing anything. We just want to make sure we're avoiding that, right? So make sure you've got at least button defined in your organization, or either the co-chairs of the safety position or the safety committee, either one. Make sure someone is primarily responsible for moving the ball down the field.
All right, that's great advice there. Okay, I have, at this point, I have one last question. So everyone, there's still time, but if not, this will be the last one. And this is, I think, a great thing to ponder. I'm new to the role. So this talk about succession planning seems like, wait, I'm just here. I just started, a little premature. And I'm still working for more money for training courses. I'm working to set things up. How do you approach this? What are your thoughts on that particular conundrum?
Yeah, that can certainly be daunting, especially when you're new and you're learning. You're trying to get your feet underneath you while you're learning a new role. I think I heard that we're still lobbying for money to go to training and stuff like that.
Right.
That makes sense why it might feel like an awkward conversation to have about succession planning and defining your role. But the sooner you have that conversation, the easier it's going to be to open up dialogue along the way. So whoever you're having that conversation with, ultimately that's the person you're communicating with on bigger safety issues anyway. So you need to have that level of communication anyway. And hopefully that person you're talking to also has a succession plan of their own. That's a part of leadership of your team. And certainly if they have safety as a core value of the flight department, then they have these thoughts in their mind about succession planning. They don't want it to be a void that has to be filled in a rapid fashion, just like their home office or headquarters office or whoever they report to doesn't want their role to be void and not have a succession plan. So that's a part of leadership in general, to have a succession plan. It's a great part of culture, if nothing else. And that really shows how much the leadership values safety within the organization, is that we have this means of continuity, even if it is like reaching out to a third-party vendor. So it shouldn't be a scary conversation, but I totally understand that. Even maybe if you're uncomfortable having that conversation about long-term void, right? Like what happens, and you're not going to set the precedent of, hey, as soon as I go to the ISBEO course, I'm going to put that on my resume and then I'm going to leave, right? Like that's not the message we want to send. Okay, we're not just resume padding and then we're going to go somewhere else. Certainly that's not the optics we want to send, but let's start with something small, like, okay, I am primarily the safety officer and I take a 2-week vacation next summer. Who's managing focal reports, ASAP reports, things that are coming in the system, safety concerns, ERP activations, any of these items that come in? What is our plan for that? If my phone, if I'm on the beach and my phone is in the room, who's doing that? Because those small conversations can lead to bigger conversations. Once you talk about vacations, maybe short-term leave, or busy seasons, or something like that, at least starting small and employing some sort of contingency plan is a bit of a stair step into having that continuity conversation, and then eventually getting to succession planning if you're not quite comfortable having that conversation yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that baby steps. You want to go on vacation and be able to know that things are handled, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
that's just a part of that. You don't have to tackle the whole thing all at once. So that's great. Okay, Kellie, so that's it on the questions. I so appreciate Polaris Aero and all of you presenting these topics, and I think this one is definitely a very important one, especially as we move forward. Whoops, I think there's one more. Oh, here we go. Okay, we have just a few more minutes. Let me grab this one.
Absolutely.
Safety being the forefront of many operators, how do we manage size and scope of safety in the eyes of the rest of the department? Seems like things can get lost in the translation, or it's so, I like this, it's so big that it doesn't get taken seriously by others. Just leadership and how they are supporting safety that maybe other departments don't look at it the same. What are some of your thoughts about managing that in the eyes of the entire organization?
Yeah, well, so I could take that a couple different ways. If we're talking about the entire organization as like your average line personnel, like the fuelers and your accounting folks and the people that are in the day-to-day, like that sort of view, or if you're talking about your entire organization, like your flight department and your stakeholders that are flying in the back of the airplane and your home office downtown. So kind of two different views of that, and in both instances, both rely on effective communication. So size and scope for what you're doing is immediately tied to what we call managing your acceptable level of risk, right? Like that we want to manage risk to a level that is as low as reasonably practical, or ALARP. I know we've mentioned that in previous sessions before. And understanding what ALARP is, not just for the flight department, but for the home office, for your average line personnel, and be able to communicate that up and down the ladder, and making sure we're all on the same page about what that level is, Certainly your insurance folks want to know what that level is. Your
Right.
broker wants to know what that level is. Your pilots need to be able to know what that level is, so they're operating on that same level as your maintenance folks. So everyone needs to be on the same page as that, and that will help define the size and scope of what you need to be doing. I know we talk about size and scope a lot, especially with all of the stuff coming down the pipe for the FAA, NPRM for the Part 5 mandate.
Yeah. Yep.
Size and scope really is, I mean, you could do SMS and what's required of you on a cocktail napkin. If that is size and scope for your organization, you could do that. You could pull it off in the same way that you could do your flight schedule on a cocktail napkin, right? So it's all about what value are you getting for what you're putting in. And you don't have to have a big fancy system to say you have an SMS, just like you don't have to have a big fancy scheduling system to say that you have a schedule, but it's all about efficiency and business efficiency at a certain point. And by leveraging those tools, you have the ability to mature your SMS over time and dabble in different areas like ASAP and FOQA and all these different parts that may make it feel a little bit bigger. And you don't necessarily have to utilize all of those. You can grow into them over time as size and scope maybe matures over time, or as your organization grows and has the bandwidth to tackle those things over time. That's a very long-winded way of saying that you can eat the elephant one bite at a time. You don't have to do it all at the same rate. If your home office feels like you should be doing that, or your management folks feel like you should be doing that, you can do that as you go. You don't have to start from there.
Yeah.
I hope that answers the
Yeah,
question.
communicate. I think that was great. We see all sizes and shapes coming through on the ISBEO side, and just the other day, there was one with two people and at stage 3, and they're doing it. And my guess is that it looks more like the cocktail napkin than it does the multinational corporate library for their SMS. Yeah, Kellie, as always, I just so appreciate your expertise in this and your experience, and I hope that everyone here takes advantage of the fact that your email is here and bothers you about their questions going forward. So with that, we will close out the 2023 Polaris Aero SafetyNet series. These guys offer several, usually 3-part series. You'll find the recordings on I put the link in the chat there for everyone to access the recordings. That's where you'll find the recording for this one. And we'll be planning for 2024. And Kellie, again, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us and with the group. And I will wish everyone a happy holiday season, and we'll sign off until 2024. We'll see you all next year. And thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.